Hello and welcome to Tisky Sour. I'm Michael Walker and I am joined this evening by John McDonnell's ex-economic advisor, economist extraordinaire, very good friend of the show, James Meadway. How's it going?
Very well, thank you. Nice to be back.
Always a pleasure to have you. I think the last time you were here was on election night, wasn't it?
Have been, yes.
You did very well. You were up till 4 or 5. Kind of pissed by the end of it, but your analysis was still tight. I imagine we'll talk a bit about, everyone we have on this show, we talk a bit about analysis of why Labour lost, and we're going to talk about the Labour leadership a bit towards the end of the show. That will all come up. But tonight our priority is to talk about what Boris Johnson is doing. Boris Johnson now has a majority. Because everyone on the left, myself included, I have to say, has been somewhat distracted by Labour's leadership election. What the actual government are doing has gone, I suppose, let's say it hasn't been under the scrutiny that it otherwise would be. So that is what we are going to talk about today. Lots of talk from the government about plans to invest in the north, plans to have an industrial policy, a bit like what the Labour Party was talking about, some noises about green innovation here and there. So we're going to go through some particular stories later on, mainly briefings that were given to the Times that I thought were interesting. But first of all, I was wondering if you can give me, I suppose, in very broad brushstrokes, what is Johnsonomics?
Johnsonomics, right, okay. Very broad brush strokes. We have to see what they actually do, I suppose. First of all, this is Theresa May, but actually doing it, right? So it's the 2017 manifesto, but you, instead of having a Chancellor of the Exchequer who opposes and the Treasury who opposes all this, you now have a machine that's intended to deliver that. And the 2017 manifesto was... and as we're going to find out, because I do think the government's going to stick quite closely to what it says, was quite an effective rewriting of a sort of national conservative vision of what what the Tory party ought to be doing in the 21st century and what it ought to do on the economy. And strikingly, it is a break, I think, a significant one with neoliberalism. And everything that Boris Johnson has said since says that he does want to make a break with what we think of as the tenets of neoliberalism, this sort of version of what a Conservative Party does, handed down to us from Margaret Thatcher, which is, you reduce all intervention to a minimum, you focus, as it turns out, really quite heavily on what finance capital does. You deregulate where you can. This is like the story of the last 40 years in this country, right? This is the frame of operating with the all in. And if you have a government that's prepared to break with this is a break with neoliberalism as such, potentially. So I think what Johnson is doing is trying to set up a sort of post-neoliberal government and to create a form of post-neoliberal conservatism with himself as its head, as a sort of, probably the nearest comparison is something like Disraeli, who is the Tory most associated with building a working class in the 1860s, 1870s, after the expansion of the right to vote to some working class men. It's Disraeli who's able to build a mass Tory base of support, in the north of England and elsewhere. By the way, this is worth bearing in mind because this is a complete sort of stereotype that you get sometimes of like all of these places that have now got Tory MPs, particularly in the north of England. Everybody there used to vote Labour, and now suddenly they're all voting Conservative. It's farcical. There have always been a great deal for as long as you can have northern working class people voting. Some of them, at least, have voted Conservative. My grandma always voted Conservative, and there she was in Bolton and then Wigan. So that's always been there, and what you've seen over probably the last 20 years or so is this decline in the Labour support, some shift towards the Conservatives, and the Conservative plan is to build on that, and they are going to intervene to do it, is my guess. And they have now got the Treasury, I think, and it's quite unusual to see this, to the point of wanting, maybe not wanting, but attempting to potentially actually deliver quite an interventionist strategy there.
So you're basically taking Johnson on his word. So, I mean, his big pitch post the election was to say, I understand that many of the people that voted for me in the so-called Red Wall aren't natural conservatives and they want an interventionist, somewhat left policy or Christian democratic or whatever you want to call it. With an interventionist state which genuinely cares about regional inequality. You think they are going to deliver on at least some of that?
Why would they not? I mean, there are some reasons why not. One is that we might sort of think the Conservatives are just ideologically opposed to all this, but at this point in time, Boris Johnson doesn't really care about what he says or does or thinks, particularly beyond us having Boris Johnson in charge. And there may be a bit more to it than we give him credit for, but there's not much more to it. But he is very astute like this, and I think he does genuinely see an opportunity to build, the next 10, 15 years of conservative Conservative rule in this country, and this is how he's going to do it. And having delivered a great big majority like the one he has, then he has an enormous amount of authority inside the party to actually make that happen. And we'll see what his first real cabinet looks like and who he brings in. But he's there to try and do that. He's also under political pressure, some at least from these new Northern Tory MPs. They will want to see things delivered. So he does have the option of not doing this, but having created the expectation that something will happen, it's an absolute gift for everybody who opposes him if he doesn't actually deliver on it. So therefore he's going to try and deliver. The question at that point becomes, will this work? Will he be able to deliver in the form that people expect? And will it bind people to the Conservative Party in the way that he wants to see happen?
We'll talk about all those issues going through the specific briefings that the Tories have been giving, what precise policies we will be looking at over the next months and years. But first of all, you're watching Tysky Sour, you're watching Novara Media. As you know, this show is only possible because of you guys. It's because you donate to our channel. We can go almost nightly at the moment. As you know, there is no billionaires that fund Novara. Why would they? It's just you. So go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, or give us a New Year bonus, put a super chat in the comments. However you give your money to us, we appreciate it. As ever, like this on Facebook. Well, no, you can't like it on Facebook. Share it on Facebook. Share it on Twitter. Like it on YouTube. It means more people see it. Keep your comments coming. We'll go to your questions at the end of the show. But also, if you go on Twitter and either put your comments or your questions with the hashtag TyskySour, we will also be looking at those. We prefer those, actually, because it means that more people are directed to the show. I'm going to go to now a Times story from December. So this was almost immediately after the election. The headline is Boris Johnson spending plan, £80 billion road and rail upgrade for the North. So this is the story immediately after the election. Tories briefed they were planning to reward voters in northern seats with £80 billion of infrastructure spending. Their manifesto gives them £100 billion to spend on capital projects. £22 billion has already been allocated to flood defences and potholes, so the rest is up for grabs. They've said £39 billion is going to go to Northern Powerhouse Rail in spring. Well, it will be announced in the spring budget. And then from the article, we have a senior Tory Conservative saying, we've got, and I quote, "We've got to show the voters in the red wall seats that they have something to show for voting Conservative. The fiscal rules mean there is a good-sized pot of money available." There's also the interesting fact in the article that transport spending per head at the moment is over the last, I think, decade has been £739 per head in London and only £305 in the north. So there's a huge gap. Historically, the Tories promising to correct that. I mean, this seems like the kind of thing the Labour Party would have been announcing before the election, right?
No, they copied it. It's strikingly an awful lot of what they've been talking about. We can come on to what they've said about rewriting the rules of the Treasury and closing regional gaps in investment spending. It's straight out of the Labour manifesto. And there's been a number of things like that. It's entirely deliberate and somewhat cynical in their part to do this. I mean, the opportunity is there, right? The interest rates for government to borrow to invest in big capital projects like Northern Powerhouse Rail. I mean, this is a Labour policy to do this from back in 2017. This is a rail plan pretty well worked out, put together by Transport for the North to link together Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Hull, and all the way up to Newcastle with fast rail services. And God knows North of England's crying out for this if you look at the state of public transport and railways up there in particular. So that's just sort of ready to go. They can do it cheaply because interest rates of government are so world historically low, actually, still at this point in time. And they've got every incentive to try and make that happen. The other part that they will probably want to watch out for, and this is where the pressure from MPs will be felt, is to not so much do the really big stuff. Like, because if you take the sort of standard economics in this, standard economics says if you want to seriously improve your economy in a fairly sort of standard, how do you look at the economy way of looking at things, you want GDP to pick up in these places, then you end up with a little bit of a Treasury model for that, which is you go to the centre of Manchester and you stick more things into the centre of Manchester. You go to the centre of Leeds and you do the same thing, and maybe you link those two places up. And conventional economics will tell you that is really big, important, huge gains you can get out of this. Probably what they'll want to do is find lots and lots of smaller schemes and try and put money into them. If memory serves, the manifesto had a reverse beaching fund that they were going to try and reopen lots of smaller railway lines across the north. And this
what's reverse beaching?
So the beaching cuts. The beaching report was Dr. Beaching from the 1960s. And I think this was carried out under maybe the Conservatives, maybe it ran into Harold Wilson's first government, a plan to rationalise public transport and the railway system in Britain by closing loads and loads of so-called uneconomic branch lines in the belief that in the future everyone would use a car, which sort of happens, and it's been terrible. So the Tories had this reverse beaching plan to sort of reopen local railway lines as a kind of... It's something like a pork barrel at this point, right? You're sort of handing out money to places because they're jumping up and down saying they want something. This is a long way, and incidentally, this starts to give us a sense of what we need to do to push back in this and how we're going to challenge it. This is a long way from meaningful devolution. It's just here comes Father Christmas Boris Johnson with his big sack or big vat of pork that he's going to chuck out to a few places, pat him on the head and hopefully vote for him next time round, right? That isn't meaningful devolution. That is not giving people control over what happens to their area. It's just kind of...
But it still could make a genuine difference to people's lives, right?
It could do. It could do. If they do it, it could make a difference to these economies. It could do that if they do it. The challenge, I suppose, the other bit is like, first, how much difference does it make? You set up expectations. You're going to have to deliver on them. If you talk up what can happen, people expect big things to happen. If it doesn't happen, they're disappointed with you. The more fundamental bit, and this is the bit where it gets interesting for the left, is that if for a long period of time we've been told consistently by governments, by the media, by everyone, that government itself can't do anything to change the economy. The economy is just a thing you can't touch. And suddenly the government turns up and says, actually, we can make a difference here. That's actually a good argument for us to be presented with, because it's exactly our argument.
You think it creates space for
it creates a space where you can actually make that argument happen and make it work for us.
Let's go to the next article, which is the kind of nerdy thing that I think you'll love.
Yeah, thank you.
I think you've probably mentioned it before on the show. This is from the 27th of December. Headline, Treasury to rip up public spending rules in cash boost for North and Midlands. So leading on the earlier story, and this is from the article, the Treasury is planning to rip up decades-old public spending rules in an effort to boost economic well-being in the North and the Midlands. Under proposals being drawn up before the spring budget, ministers will reassess how officials calculate the value for money of government investments in transport, infrastructure, business development and initiatives such as free ports. Investment decisions would be less focused on overall national economic growth, and for the first time, Whitehall resources would be allocated on the basis of improving the well-being of people in the North or narrowing the productivity gap with the South. The change is seen as key to fulfilling Boris Johnson's election pledge to unlock an investment bonanza in communities that voted Conservatives at the election for the first time. So I suppose to break down what the whole story is talking about, these are Treasury rules which previously civil servants, when you're deciding what project the state should invest in, would decide based on which was the best value for money, based on which created the most GDP, depending on how much money you put in. And so I suppose the easiest way to think about this is if you're deciding as a bureaucrat, should you improve rail lines between Oxford and Cambridge? I don't think there is a rail line, but in theory, hypothetically.
Is there a plan for one?
Okay, this is a perfect example then. If you're thinking, should we make a rail line between Oxford and Cambridge, or should we make a rail line between Leeds and Wakefield? The way you decide whether it's value for money is you talk about how much it's going to add to GDP, and you work out how much it's going to add to GDP by working out how much time it saves for commuters, and you value the time of commuters based on their hourly wage. So obviously it's going to tell you that it's much more valuable to make a railway line in between Oxford and Cambridge than between Leeds and Wakefield, because those people's time is worth more money, and you end up with a system that just compounds regional inequality.
That was an excellent, very concise description of the problem here, right? So the centre of why do we have major regional inequalities? Why do we have the figures you gave for the difference in transport spending per head between London? You said £700, I think. I'm not sure where it's
London.
These in the Times.
736 in London. And
736 in London, 350
739 per head in London, and only £305 in the north. So that's the spending per head, I think, per year over the last decade.
And that's a government decision to make that happen. And the reason it happens like that is basically because you have the Treasury following a set of rules. I mean, it has an institutional sort of cultural bias anyway, I think, but it also has a set of rules encoded in a document called the Green Book, which tells you, as a civil servant, how to make these kinds of decisions. And those rules encode a bias like that. If you really want to get nerdy, there's a very good paper by Diane Coyle and a collaborator, whose name I forget, on how the Treasury systematically biases its investment decisions towards London and the South East. Now, this is literally Labour policy from about 18 months ago that John McDonnell said that he was going to try and rewrite the rules of the Treasury in order to get rid of this bias. I wrote a paper about it myself over last summer, and the Tories have just taken it and said they're going to do this. If they can push it through, it ought to make some difference to how the Treasury operates and how you're going to make those sorts of decisions. The bit they miss out, I think, and this is getting truly nerdy at this point, but the bit they miss out is that this is going to be looking solely a sort of GVA, gross value added per head measure of what you should be doing. It's not going to be focused on something like how do we deal with climate change. And it's not going to be focused, and they're not going to make any difference, to get really technical, to how the Treasury thinks about the future. In other words, changing the discount rate is what it's called, to how it decides it to make those decisions. At the minute, the
so
Treasury...
it still might be short-termist.
Yeah, so
which would make sense if what you want to do is get re-elected in 5 years, eh?
So it still encodes, from the sounds of things, a kind of short-termist bias rather than a long-term way of thinking about the future. It's not part of a plan to deal with big social challenges. It's just going out and finding a few projects. If you look... There's a turning into a truly nerdy Novara Media episode.
Our audience are a bunch of nerds.
Well, if you want to go and dig it out, the National Infrastructure Pipeline has a huge list of projects right throughout the country that you can sort of pick off and say, let's do that, let's do that, let's do that. Right? If the Treasury rules loosen your ability to go off and spend outside of London, the South East, whereas at the minute most of those projects just don't make the cut, then potentially you can go and release funding to go and do this. And I imagine they'll do this quite rapidly. Now, the challenge is, of course, big infrastructure projects take a long time to actually have an impact, right? People might be able to see something happening, but not necessarily.
Well, there'll be some jobs and there'll be sort of a multiplier effect in the community.
There'll be some jobs,
right?
Yeah, potentially. But it's sort of, again, you're back to like, okay, Northern Powerhouse Rail, it's a good project, right? We need to overhaul railway and public transport across the north of England. It's been woefully underinvested in for a long period of time. In the first instance, this benefits like Manchester and central Manchester, centre of Leeds, the centre of Liverpool. These are places actually doing relatively all right. If you want to make investments that make a difference to places that haven't done all right, you need to think outside of that. And you need to start to think about, well, what you're going to do in relatively smaller spending, in smaller towns. So what do you spend in Burnley or Barnsley or one of the places that switched to Tory this time round? And then somebody can see it fairly visibly. And I suspect that'll end up just being loads and loads of minor roads improvements. And there you go. This is our big attempt to turn the economy around. By the way, the bigger picture in this, incidentally, is this sort of focus on infrastructure spending was at the heart of what Donald Trump said he was going to do.
Yep.
When he was approaching the election,
right?
But didn't, yeah, exactly, in 2016. So he had, I think, it was $1 trillion infrastructure plan. And he did get as far as laying out a big list of plans. And if you look at all the kind of Rust Belt places that are supposed to be getting the money, he wasn't able to get through that through Congress. There's all political incompetence involved with this. Steve Bannon, if memory serves, the terrible Steve Bannon, part of his reason for resigning and going off in a huff, other than being, actually not what he was talked up to be, was that he wanted to deliver this infrastructure plan. He saw it as key to building a sort of nationalist majority inside of America. You deliver something on the ground and then you say, this is why we're doing it, because America's great, America first. They weren't able to do that and he got shoved out of the way. Now, so there's something here that if you have this sort of nationalist political project of some description, then doing big infrastructure spending and all the rest of it seems to be part of that. And it's relatively cheap for governments to do this. What's striking over the last 10 years, you had governments consistently in Britain not doing this, and that's weird because it's so cheap for them to do this.
We're going to do our final Labour-inspired conservative policy, this time not about infrastructure, but about technology. We are looking at an article from the 22nd of December in the Times, again, Super College in Northern England to give Powerhouse an almighty high-tech boost. So quoting from the article now, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT in Boston, boasts 96 Nobel laureates and helped to create the web, computer games, spreadsheets, fax machines, GPS, and disposable razors. Now, the north of England could be set to get its own version of MIT as part of Boris Johnson's plans to boost the region's economy. The government is in discussions to set up a new institution that would provide space, technical support, and seed money for the next James Dyson trying to invent products for a global market. Jake Berry, the Northern Powerhouse Minister, is leading discussions on setting up an MIT of the North as part of a multi-billion-pound investment package for the region. Leeds is being touted as a possible location. Again, this is exactly the kind of policy that the Labour Party were talking about. Seems to me inspired by Mariana Mazzucato, who talks about how you need to have an entrepreneurial state making partnerships with firms to turbocharge innovation. They've been talking about how this could be, it could favour green technologies, etc., etc. Again, is this genuine? Do you see this?
This one feels a little bit more shaky for a couple of reasons, 3 reasons really. Firstly, it's a Labour policy. John's very first speech as Shadow Chancellor, at least his first sort of official policy speech, it talks about exactly this sort of thing and how you use science to deliver, prosperity outside of London and that sort of thing. It was a bit of a Harold Wilson feel to it, but it was based on.
Was that the socialism with an iPad?
Yeah, that's the one back in the day. So this is Mariana Mazzucato's thinking on an entrepreneurial state. The government has to intervene alongside private actors in the market to make economies work, and that's how we get innovation and all the rest of it. So that's taken up. Dominic Cummings himself is a big fan of this sort of thing. Dominic Cummings is not a neoliberal, as we might normally think of one. He's very, very interventionist in a particular kind of way. The person he reminds me of in terms of his politics, I suppose, this is slightly obscure, is perhaps somebody like Corelli Barnett, who wrote a series of books, who's an economic historian, wrote a series of books on Britain's decline after the Second World War and how governments were too focused on doing welfare and didn't spend enough time and effort doing proper industrial strategy, investing in key sectors and this sort of thing. I think Cummings, if he's close to anything, although I don't think he's ever mentioned Corelli Barnett, is close to that sort of vision.
You have to do a Control F on his blog.
Yeah, you ought to. Somebody. I mean, I've probably read more than is a good idea to read his bloody blog, but I don't remember seeing that name in particular cropping up. But he's not a neoliberal. He doesn't hold to some sort of basic kind of rules about austerity and government spending, as far as I can tell. He's a bit sort of vague about it, but he personally doesn't. Other governments have thought about doing this. The coalition government had a whole load of plans. They got in, what was his name? Herman Hauser, the guy who was behind Acorn Computers, big investor in venture capital, in science and that sort of thing, to write a report on how to deliver, development spend, not just research spending, but at the end of the research pipeline, right towards how do you get things that you can apply and put into the economy. Development spending, historically, something that's weak in Britain. Britain's quite bad at this, quite good at pure research, not so good at development spending. Setting up what eventually turned into what they call catapult centres. This is incredibly policy focused, but okay. But the point being,
catapults it from the lab into the marketplace.
So these things chugging away all around the country. There's various more specialised in particular markets on a not a particularly big scale. This is where I think that perhaps this one's got a bit more spin to it, right? What's an MIT for the North really going to do? Leeds is a good place to do it because Leeds has obviously it's a very good university, a very good record with producing all sorts of spin-outs and lots and lots of scientific progress. So you can see why they locate in this place. What it actually turns into, I mean, MIT has extraordinarily large amounts of money to throw at stuff. That's why it does well. I mean, that's a crude version of it, plus a long history of doing this, right? Leeds has less money, long history, less money. So unless they're going to pump in that kind of really, really big amounts of cash, I feel like MIT for the North is not going to be.
You need billions and billions to make that.
It's going to be more on the spin end of things, I think.
We're going to go on to whether or not Dominic Cummings is going in and against the state in a moment to, I suppose, increase continue on the theme of whether or not the Conservatives are adopting many of the ideas and policies that were developed within the Labour movement over the last 4 years. But first of all, I suppose I want to say, given that the Conservatives appear to be, and in your sort of interpretation are, adopting many of Labour's economic policies, then from an economic perspective, obviously, when it comes to migration and racism, etc., there's a bunch of things you can oppose this government on. When it comes to economic policy, what's the critique of this government from the left?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is that you can sort of stay on their terrain, right? If they're trying to set these things up, we're going to do all these things to make stuff better for people.
Yeah,
that's the kind of message here. Then the first one is to sort of set the expectations higher than the Tories would like it to be. And they've already set them quite high, I think, with a lot of this stuff. If it filters out, then people will have an expectation things will matter. Now, what the issue there is that if you have places where basically for 40 years no one's really invested on any serious scale, and it remains to be seen, let's not get carried away whether the Tories will actually do this. Let's not just assume it's going to happen. There's every chance that this doesn't make it through the machinery of government and the Tory party's own natural biases and all sorts of other things. This could, turn into an awful lot of hot air and not very much delivery. But when you're dealing with places that haven't had much investment for a long period of time, expectations are low. So you may not have to do very much to sort of meet those expectations. But nonetheless, you can play up to the expectations and say, look, if you're going to do this, you've got to do it properly. This is what this really means, right? So you set the bar further and you say, okay, you have to do these things. And if you fail to do these things, you are failing. Now that's kind of on their terms. That's kind of still within the zone of whether or not they are going to spend the money and what's it going to do. I think the smarter bit, or the bits we can get to, is first of all, this isn't going to address a whole load of the fundamentals. This isn't going to do anything about the gig economy, insecurity at work, right? You're going to have a shiny new railway, but everyone's still going to be in sort of terrible disguised self-employment work, driving whichever taxi firm it is to drop people off to get in the shiny new railway line.
Because we already know they're going to be attacking trade union rights,
exactly.
right?
So
especially for people who are driving trains.
Yeah, quite.
So these are going to be train drivers who are banned from going on strike.
Exactly. So you driving the taxi in your gig economy, utterly insecure, are going to be dropping people off at the shiny new railway station, the shiny new railway, for a train with a driver who isn't allowed to go on strike. He's been made illegal, right? So this isn't addressing some of the fundamental features of the economy. This is still not doing anything about the power you do or do not have at work to make a difference. And also, it's sort of, like I said, the potential with the infrastructure spending is that this multiplier effect just means you turn the centre of Manchester, even, for example, I shouldn't really pick in Manchester, it's a very nice city, but you turn the centre of Manchester even more into a kind of mini version of London. You overheat it even more, and you don't actually do very much for
except that's precisely
towns.
what they're saying they will do. So they've said they will be doing it.
Look, I think they're going to go for a whole stack of relatively minor road improvements and things like this. Right? That's the sort of which incidentally the Treasury would be quite happy doing, because it prefers to spend lots and lots of small amounts of money rather than great big amounts of money. Boris Johnson himself, of course, is someone who wants to talk about spending loads of money on really big things. He loves the grand project, Boris Bridge, Boris Island, whatever other loopy the bridge I was thinking of was from Scotland to Northern Ireland, wasn't it? But there was also the Garden Bridge he didn't build, and also the bridge that he's not going to build from Scotland to Northern Ireland, one assumes. Boris Airport, they need to get into spending bits of money everywhere to make a clear and visible difference to things. So that's kind of one part of it. The third part, I think, is even more fundamentally that this is actually, we can start to talk more seriously about ownership and decentralisation and genuine devolution. We are not here to tug our forelocks, if you're in the north of England, say, thank you very much, Boris Johnson, thank you kindly for dispensing this largesse. We should be there demanding things and saying, give us the money, this is how we're going to spend it. If you look at what George Osborne, who's kind of a bit of a precursor to some of this stuff, did with the Northern Powerhouse, after starving councils in the north of England of cash for a good number of years, he then sort of dangles a bit of money. They all fall over themselves, pretty understandably, to try and get a bit of that money, and it comes attached to very, very strict conditions from the Treasury about how they're allowed to spend it or not. Right? That isn't devolution. That's tugging your forelock. That's kind of charitable handout from the rich people down in London to the poor starving people in the north of England. Right? That's not what we're about. We need to be talking a language of power and democracy and decentralisation and giving people something that they can do themselves and giving agency back to people in some of these places. So you need local councils with the power and authority to actually make some of these things happen themselves. They need more powers to borrow. They need more powers potentially to tax. They need greater.
And the Tories presumably won't want to do that because lots of these places have a Labour council.
Absolutely not. I mean, they might somewhere down the line, once you've finally converted every Labour council to a Tory council, which they're not going to do, you might then want to do it, but you really don't want to do that sort of thing. You're not serious about devolution. You don't actually want devolution. You want to control the amount of money because you want basically a sort of, a rather sort of hireling, a kind of servile attitude from the people you're dishing out money to. I think that's the fundamental politics of it. And that is something we can work hard against.
I want to talk about Dominic Cummings. You've said you've been reading a lot of his blog. You were a civil servant.
I said I read too much.
You were a civil servant briefly, weren't you?
Yeah, I was.
Or maybe not briefly, I don't know.
Quite a long period of time, yeah.
How long did you work in the Treasury for?
How long was there for? Actually, it wasn't that long. I'm trying to think. 3 years? 2.5 years? Yeah.
I just say that because a lot of what Dominic Cummings has been writing about and a lot of the news stories about him are his I suppose, disdain for the civil service and plans to shake it up. This hit the news last week because of a blog post he wrote, which was asking for applications to join him in Downing Street. It had lots of veiled critiques of the mediocrity of the civil service. It requested applications from data scientists and software developers, economists, policy experts, project managers, communications experts, junior researchers, one of whom will be my personal assistant, and then weirdos and misfits with odd skills. I mean, I suppose this is just one blog post calling for people to work for him, but it does have a lot of veiled critiques of the civil service. He is saying, I want to transform how the civil service make decisions. We talked about that in a wonky way earlier. Mm-hmm. But is Dominic Cummings going in and against the state? Yes,
I can see your ironic use of a phrase in recent years more obviously associated with John McDonnell. The issue with Cummings, I think I'm right about this. We know he's good at campaigning. He's run 3 successful campaigns that have had a serious impact on national politics. So that's the way back in the day, the regional assembly, ironically, referendum up in the northeast, which was expected to go in favour of regional assembly with some powers. It's New Labour 2004, I think.
So he's anti-devolution, presumably. We can infer from that.
Exactly.
Well, that's because he thinks anything he's kind of against constitutional reform because he considers it a waste of money. He had the same argument against AV, no to AV. I think he was involved in that campaign because he was like, this is a waste of money.
Okay, potentially that's 4 then. But so there's that, which took charge. He claims he took charge of, and let's assume he did, and delivered obviously the referendum, and obviously now the 2019 campaign. So we know he's a good campaigner. He has, I think, some relatively unusual ideas in a sort of Tory firmament, in terms of like, I will intervene, I don't care, that sort of thing. But to a large extent, he's very, very good at self-publicity and at publicising himself. If you can get a film made about the campaign you ran, and you, who is Dominic Cummings, get Benedict Cumberbatch to play yourself. I mean, that's pretty good going, right? I mean, if you look at the two of them, right, it's not bad. So he's good at self-publicity. He's good at creating an image, and a great deal of our media who always look for a kind of Svengali figure. I mean, do you remember Nick Timothy? They always want someone to point at. I mean, Seamus Milne got some of this, right? You always want someone to point at the secret power behind the throne, who's the mastermind, who's making all the decisions, all that sort of stuff. So he plays up to that an awful lot, and I think the blog post is playing up to that. I didn't recognise most of those references in terms of William Gibson, so obviously I'm not as well read as him, but I think that's what's going on here. And I don't think it's necessarily the case that one person sitting in Whitehall can really necessarily make a great deal of difference to the pretty big institutional machinery of the British civil service. I mean, it is possible to reform this, but it is quite hard to do that. The major civil service reforms I can think of at the top of my head are Northcote Trevelyan in the 1860s or so, which is what introduces the idea of a professional civil service that is politically neutral. It's simply there to carry out the wishes of ministers. There's then the Thatcher reforms of the 80s. Thatcher had all this about the civil service. She thought they were all far too collectivist and left-wing and all the rest of it, and tried to shake them up in various different ways, and arguably did. I mean, I think core parts of the civil service, and if you look at the Treasury, take classic example, are deeply neoliberal. I mean, that's just how they think about the world. But that's not quite the same as delivering the sort of programme that Boris Johnson wants to deliver. So Dominic Cummings, as, yes, admittedly an influential advisor sitting in the middle of government, is going to find it quite hard to transform the whole of the civil service. David Cameron did this, actually. He had a whole load of slightly odd ideas. Do you remember, what was his name? Steve Hilton, coming in. That was his Svengali guru and all the rest of it.
Who went on to be a Fox News
pundit. Yeah, and a big Trump fan and all the rest of it. Yes, so there you go. Oh, how the mighty, not really. So it's
probably better paid being.
Yeah, true. Actually, I shouldn't knock it.
Head.
Well, I mean, yeah, no. I mean, I'm just trying to think which is worst or better out of those two jobs, and I don't think I'd honestly choose unemployment.
I mean, I think going as a Fox News host, sort of trying to say why, as a progressive populist, you should back Donald Trump is probably worse than being an advisor.
I think so. I think, yeah, okay. No, you're right. Okay, that's definitely.
I mean, they're both bad, but one of them is. I think one of them is more like you're going to hell.
There are scales of bad. There are definitely, there's a sliding scale of worses here, and I should be less extreme in my condemnation of all forms of Steve Hilton, whichever particular variety emerges in. But David Cameron had a nudge unit which was going to reform how the whole of government operated. Yeah. We weren't going to do big interventions. We were just going to use behavioural economics to carefully poke people into doing things.
Nudging was the whole nudge craze was the least ambitious government reform ever, though, wasn't it? So we're not going to do big projects. We're just going to have these minor changes to incentives to make people get less fat.
Yeah. So Cummings isn't doing this. Cummings is all like, no, we're going to have a mad AI that's going to tell you what to do. So shut up and listen. I bet he's quite keen on social credit systems and all this sort of stuff. I bet you give him half a chance he want to set one of them up.
Well, I think he talks quite positively about the Chinese government.
Exactly.
Because he thinks that they function in a, efficient way because they're an they're an efficient bureaucracy. They've generated 10% GDP growth, and I think because they have a fairly meritocratic system, right? Even if it is a bit authoritarian, well, not a bit authoritarian, even if they've put millions of Muslims in detention centres because they haven't denounced their own religion.
We could go off on a tangent about what is the state in China like. If your idea is that this is a massively efficient centralised bureaucracy, is what's going on in China for the last 30, 40 years. This is a serious mistake in thinking about how Chinese growth has happened. It's massively decentralised. But
yeah, well, isn't it still? It's decentralised. I mean, we won't talk about China for too long, but isn't it decentralised, but also values success? So my understanding of how Chinese growth came about was that you had different regions with a relatively decentralized economic policy. And what was good about that is it meant that regions could experiment with what worked, and then the central government, the central authority, would reward those regions where it was going well, and then try and percolate those policies into the other regions. So if you had, I suppose, did it all start in Shenzhen?
Shenzhen, yeah.
So if it was going well in Shenzhen, then they say sort of like, oh, this part of the country where it's been going well, let's try and diffuse those policies elsewhere. And you have a sort of, and the Communist Party is at the top at least, a machine of highly competent people where sort of competence is rewarded, even if not, a particularly humanist society that rewards and tries to allow diversity and human rights to flourish.
I think that slightly condenses the last sort of 40 years or so of Chinese growth and development. There's sort of two stages. We really could end up going down a rabbit hole on this one. There are sort of two stages to this, one of which is the early part from 78 onwards, the early part of reforms, which is decentralising massively and introducing sort of market mechanisms on a small scale, but right the way across great chunks of the country, and also bringing the special economic zones slightly later on in places like Shenzhen and a few others.
Isn't that like free ports? A free port's a bit like special economic zones, because this Conservative government is going to bring in free ports, which is basically you have a port with no regulations. Yes. So VAT isn't charged. Yeah. What else happens at a free port?
Oh God. Well, I mean, you can do sort of variations of this. The sort of the Tory one post Brexit is to basically say, right, we're going to get rid of duties on different goods coming in and out, and therefore everyone's going to want to locate their manufacturing here because it's going to be easy to manufacture stuff. We'll probably get rid of regulations, who you can employ and when you can hire and fire them, and you'll act as a massive sort of attractive place to invest in and make loads of stuff and employ loads of people, and we'll re-industrialise the northeast of England, which is, there are Tory metro mayors and Tory MPs really pushing heavily to make that happen in the northeast. Now, this is the evidence for this working in societies like Britain. And there are some developed countries, America being the obvious example, where free ports are set up. The evidence this working is actually fairly minimal. What tends to happen is it's a good old zero-sum game. In other words, you have jobs being created here at the cost of jobs disappearing somewhere else. So the net gain is like zero jobs or close to zero jobs. In addition to which, you're simply undermining pay and conditions and all the rest of it. That you set up a free port not because you expect to deliver loads of growth and all the rest of it, but you want it as a kind of horrendous deregulatory cuckoo in the nest that when it hatches, it destroys all regulation around it, that sort of thing. So that is probably like, if there's a longer term thinking on what a free port does at a national level, that's where you want to try and set the things up. The actual benefits of these are massively oversold, and massively oversold by the Conservative Party. In a less developed country like China, and you do this on a really big scale, you can get something happening. But bear in mind also that was a process also of opening China up to the world through joining things like the World Trade Organization in 2000, and that's a sort of separate stage.
Because in a developing country, I suppose it's very attractive to corporations because you see it as an area which is insulated from what you might see as an unstable government or somewhere where governance isn't doesn't conform to the high standards that an international capitalist expects. But when you're in Britain, that's not really a worry anyway.
And key to this, of course, is the presence of a genuinely centralised element in Chinese economy, which is the state-owned enterprises, which are enormous and still enormous. China National Petroleum Company until very recently was one of the largest companies on the planet. And it's entirely state-owned, and that is something you can centrally control and kind of sets how the whole thing operates. So that's why China, isn't necessarily, I hate to break it to everyone, a model for Middlesbrough, let's say, or anywhere else in this country in quite the way that sometimes it gets talked up.
We're going to talk about the Labour leadership election because we love talking about the Labour leadership election. First of all, some people in the comments are saying that when a quote comes up or an image, they lose audio. That's fine now. Great. We are going to, apologies for that, but apparently it is all sorted now. We're going to talk about what we've discussed about Conservative policy, what that says about how the Labour Party should oppose, I suppose, not just the economic policy of this government, but wholesale. What is the project of opposition for the next 5 years? What are going to be the dividing lines between the Conservatives and Labour? I want to introduce this conversation with Rebecca Long-Bailey's, or quotes from Rebecca Long-Bailey's launch piece in Tribune yesterday. So there was, it took a while for Becky Long-Bailey to enter this race, beyond a sort of an article in The Guardian that sort of floated her candidature before the new year. She did last night. Quite an impressive, expansive article in Tribune. Fair play to her for launching her, article in a left publication, not in The Guardian, who, if she maintains anything like the policy platform that Corbyn had, will be attacking her within 3 months. So that was positive. Let's take a couple quotes from it. Also, first of all, actually, we should say that the organising principle in this article was to say that if we go harder on the Green New Deal, that's how we win an election. We lost in 2019 because we undersold it. And then the paragraph which summarises her vision of how Labour beat the Tories says, and I quote, "To win, we need to rebuild Labour as an insurgent force and offer a vision for a new democracy. We must go to war with the political establishment, pledging a constitutional revolution that sweeps away the House of Lords, takes big money out of politics and radically shifts power away from Westminster. My vision of a democratic decarbonised economy alongside a new economy that hands power and wealth back to ordinary people is one that can win. It can unite all of Labour's heartlands from our young, diverse strongholds in English cities to Scotland, Wales, and deindustrialise areas in the Midlands and North." Is Rebecca Long-Bailey barking up the right tree when it comes to beating the Conservatives in 2024?
The bit that's interesting there is the introduction of the idea of constitutional reform. Right, and that I think is critical and will be critical for us, because there is a sort of danger. There's a danger that's implicit in what she's written there, which is all good stuff, right? I mean, you're not going to sit here and say, "Oh, well, we don't like the Green New Deal, we don't like all these things you're talking about." Yeah, we should have Labour as an insurgent force. I agree. The challenge is, what does that actually mean, really? Because just saying you're an insurgent force doesn't necessarily work, right? You have to do something a bit more than that. And the particular challenge, I think, with Labour is a version of what you might call God, it's lefty jargon here, but it's sort of economism, that you want to just talk about the economy. And you have a particular version of talking about the economy, which isn't really talking about the economy as a space of kind of implied conflict in one form or another, or the distribution of power and control and who can do what to whom, and that's really what the economy is about. You want to talk about the economy as a distribution of just things. Right, so it's not about relationships between people and the institutions they use to relate to each other and then how that affects the things. It's just a relationship of things. And we're going to make more of these things, and these things are good things, and you all like the things. And we're here in charge, so here's a load of investment in renewable energy. Right, here's the thing for you. Here's a load of electric cars. Yeah, do you see what I mean?
To try and clarify, I mean, what you, not to say that it wasn't clear, but you know,
may not have been.
What Becky Long-Bailey is doing by centering the Green New Deal or posing the Green New Deal as being a magic bullet, which, to be honest, I think kind of that article was doing, is that she is saying, or not moving away from the frame of the Labour Party will win by promising you nice things.
Yeah, I think there's also this need, and it's obviously something that she's identified, because I think there's been a discussion about it around the Labour Party just over the Christmas period. That identified also a need to talk about the distribution of political power, and that's what that key bit there is about constitutional reform. This is going to be unavoidable. I mean, if you take her earlier article in The Guardian when it's talk about progressive patriotism. Now, there's great chunks of the left that jump up and down and say, "Oh my God, why are you talking about patriotism? Why are you talking about..." Well, look, if we can have a conversation about this. The problem with the article wasn't so much that you said progressive patriotism. It's just that there was no content to this. What is this progressive patriotism? Is it just do the same thing but paint a Union Jack on it? It doesn't work. And it doesn't work, and that's the problem. It doesn't work in a very specific way. Because if you say progressive patriotism made in Britain, well, okay, what does that say to Scotland, who is going to have an absolute almighty row about independence or not over the foreseeable period? What does it even say to people in Wales, for that matter, if you're saying in Britain, with an appearance of genuinely popular demands for kind of Welsh independence, certainly more Welsh autonomy? It's not good enough to just go implicitly, it's the kind of English patriotism that we're talking about, we're going to call it made in Britain. It doesn't resolve the constitutional problems we're now faced with. That part of really, it's a sort of long-term decline of Britain away from being the peak capitalist country on the entire planet. And that's a very long decline. That's a decline from about 1890, let's say, 1870. German unification, there you go. So that's a long old decline to where we've got now, to what it really is, which is a sort of medium-sized country that's quite well off. Very poorly distributed wealth inside of it, but that's what it is. Part of that decline is the appearance of this constitutional question. And we're running up hard against it. Because one of the issues, very much tied up into the whole row about Brexit and leaving the European Union, is actually that issue of democracy and sovereignty and what it means to have, take back control and have some control over your lives and the rest of it. And we need answers to those things. And you could see the Tories are talking about abolishing the House of Lords now. And this is virtually a photocopy of Labour policy, which was there in the 2019 manifesto. But I think we're going to have to start putting that sort of thing front and centre and start talking seriously about devolution inside of England, for example, and create a form where this isn't just wonk speak for devolution, but it's actually this will matter to you on the ground. This is what we're going to do. We're also, as an incidental point, we're also going to have to think about how we oppose what this government is doing, because it will still be And you saw the announcement today about, we're looking for efficiency savings. I'm sorry, this is how George Osborne started austerity. Right? They are still Tories. They are still going to do these things. It isn't just bonanza for it. That's certainly not going to be it. The Institute of Fiscal Studies analysis of what fairly limited content there was in the 2019 manifesto said this bakes in austerity. There will still be conflicts. And one of the places we're going to have that conflict with government will be in local areas, with local councils opposing what government is doing. And we've got to have to think seriously about how we build bases of support outside of just thinking what happens in Westminster and then eventually we'll win the election. We have to rebuild the party in a big way. That is, by the way, why I think various versions of what you called a magic bullet, which is let's do the Green New Deal, or let's have a leader with a northern accent, these sort of things, or let's just pretend we could have said something different about Brexit and then that will magic into winning next time round. If only it wasn't for Brexit, we'd have done so well in 2019. Hate to break it to everyone, really not true, right? But we don't need to get into the ins and outs of how that position would have mattered. This is a long-term problem for Labour. This is a decline that's been taking place for 20 years now. It really becomes noticeable and starts under Blair. Blair lost 4 million votes for Labour between his first election and his last. Right, that's the decline. We haven't recovered those votes.
But he also won 2 million between 1992 and
he goes up and then it drops further down. And it doesn't recover. The only person who's had a serious
step forward,
recovery,
3 steps back.
The only person who's had a serious recovery in the Labour vote, well, Miliband a bit, and then Jeremy Corbyn dramatically, and then down again, although still net gain by 2019. Now, that is a serious long-term decline, similar to what is taking place for European social democratic parties right the way across the continent. It is not enough to just say, we've got a magic bullet here, we'll resolve it. There are major structural, institutional issues we have to address, one of which in this country, and this does take a specific form, is the issue of the Constitution and the democratic settlement. And we need a popular, radical way to talk about it.
Are you not in danger of seeing constitutional reform as another magic bullet, though?
No, because at this point, you have to say, well, what's the strategy to win? And then you put it in terms of, well, actually, we need to, it's what Jeremy Gilbert has called the ideology of Labourism. That there is only the Labour Party, everyone should be in the Labour Party, everyone will vote for the Labour Party, and then we'll just kind of pull the levers of government and distribute stuff. Well, that clearly is not working and hasn't really worked, and you can argue ever, but certainly for a good period of time now, that we have to. What else are you going to do, in terms of how do we win back Scotland? Win back Scotland. Well, I mean, look, at least part of that, I think, is that we're going to have to stop thinking about Scottish Labour Party as being a sort of version of the British Labour Party in Scotland. It has to be a Labour Party for Scotland, and ditto for Wales. That you need to give these organisations autonomy. These are some of the things that Clive Lewis has been talking about, and I think he's right on this. That you have to have a strategy in which you identify this need to build a coalition that can win, and that coalition does not necessarily all end up inside the Labour Party at any given point in time. That's where the issue of the Constitution starts coming. That's where the demands for democracy and power and the rest all fit in. So there is a strategy there. And it may or may not be the right strategy. I'd hope one of the things that happens in the leadership contest, you at least have a bit of time to talk about these things and to seriously debate them. Because as if we just end up with an argument that is same as 2019, but a bit louder or better messaging. I mean, we can certainly do better messaging. That is true. We can always do better messaging. But if it's just that, you don't actually seriously address the long-term decline of a Labour Party vote. It is possible to do this. We know that out there are very large numbers of particularly young workers who vote Labour. How do you build on that base that we have into the rest of society? There are ways to make this happen, and I think we need to think more seriously about how we deliver it.
I suppose, so that last thing, so in terms of the constitutional reform thing, I get it, and especially when it comes to proportional representation, what I find most convincing is the argument, well, it's not the argument, the evidence that shows that in countries where you have proportional representation, you have much longer periods of left-wing government or more frequent periods of left-wing government, and also you have much greater income equality. And that's because actually this is really geeky as well. So the political economy argument for it is to say that they sort of divide the country into 3 groups of voters. So you have high-income voters, low-income voters, and middle-income voters. And they say that in a proportional representation system, these 3, this is all modelled. It's not to say that society works exactly like this, but they say that you can imagine these 3 groups of voters as being, conservative, socialist, and liberal. Your middle ones are, your middle-income people are a bit liberal. And in a proportional representation system, you have 3 parties. And the middle income people in this party, they prefer to ally with the left-wing ones because then they get to divide up the resources of the rich guys. And the rich guys have more money, so there's more to divide. So if you're a middle income person, you are confident allying with the left because you do it on your own terms, and you can stop them taxing the middle class. And so that's why you get long periods of left government or centre-left government in Europe. In first-past-the-post systems, these middle-income voters, they're worried about voting for the left because they feel like they're more likely to tax them more highly. So what they do is they vote right. And it's a very parsimonious, a very simple explanation, which I think does quite well at showing why in majoritarian first-past-the-post systems, you tend to have more right-wing governments and you tend to have far less redistribution. And the argument for first-past-the-post from left-wingers is this sort of Leninist argument that it's only via first-past-the-post that you can have complete control of the state and then massively transform it. But given that the majority of the population are not Leninists and don't want a bunch of lefties to massively transform the state without any checks and balances, that's probably not a winning strategy.
It's, what you've identified there is a sort of historic strategy of the British left. I'll come back to the thing about middle-income voters, but the historic strategy of the British left is, probably the clearest formulation of it, one way or the other, is the old Communist Party of Great Britain's document, The British Road to Socialism, which says that, there's kind of two parts of the movement. You have the political party, which is Labour, which gets into power here, and then you have the trade union movement, which both has a sort of industrial clout. It has the power in the factories. This is written in the 50s. Power in the factories to, take on the capitalists there. And importantly, it has a sort of organic link to the working class. And you put the two together, and that's how you have a very powerful combination of things that can deliver all these big reforms for everybody else. And that's the theory. The challenge you have at the minute is, it's in two parts, really. The first is that where is the trade union movement? The figures on this are quite dramatic and somewhat horrifying. Headline numbers look good, reasonably good, right? Union density, the proportion of the workforce in the trade union is still around 30% or so, isn't it? If you start to dig into that bit, you realise this is overwhelmingly in the public sector. Right, first one. In the public sector, after a few years of austerity, there aren't many governments since the war that have actually cut public sector payroll. In fact, there's only one, which is David Cameron and George Osborne. Everybody else sees a slight increase one way or the other, including Margaret Thatcher, if you take a fairly big, broad definition of public sector employees and those paid by the public sector. So that's shrinking anyway. You then go and look at the private sector, and at that point you're down to like what appear to be sort of American levels of unionisation, it's 12%, something like this. And you think, well, that's not great. And then you dig into it further and you realise there's an incredibly large number of those. I think perhaps even a majority of private sector union members are in firms and institutions that used to be nationalised. Right, so this is a legacy of trade union organisation, heavily from the public sector, one way or the other. It's somewhat disguised because, privatised, right, but it's there. If you take the rest of the private sector economy, the number of people working in firms and in workplaces without a single trade union member present is absolutely through the roof. The number of young people joining trade unions has fallen off. The broad picture here is headline figures look quite good, but you're isolated in a certain part of the economy. The broader thing of the institutions of the labour movement that a well-implanted trade union movement would have and support, labour clubs and all this sort of thing, that's all kind of dwindled away somewhere. So this leg of your strategy has just disappeared. You then go, okay, you've got the Labour Party, but the trouble is that, if you say it's a British road to socialism, well, we've just talked about the problem with Britain, which is that, okay, Scotland's gone or going.
Yep.
Wales are a similar argument. None of this works. None of this works. So your standard strategy of like, here we have the mighty union movement and the mighty Labour Party, and we're going to be in power and we're going to make this happen, which reaches its apogee in the 60s and 70s. It's formalised by governments in the 70s. Just crumbles away in front of us. And we're not going to be able to reinvent it in the space of 4 or 5 years. Now, all right, never say never. Who knows what might turn up? But I don't think we're just going to resurrect up the entire set of institutional structures that's there. We have to look for something else. We live, and this is where I'm getting onto the middle class thing, we live in an increasingly polarised society, polarised in terms of income. The kind of economy where you produce, the British private sector would regularly produce stable, basically well-paid, relatively well-paid, middle class or skilled working class jobs. Manufacturing was particularly good at producing by the 60s, 70s, producing a layer of relatively better paid, relatively stably employed workers and middle class occupations. All that has disappeared because you got rid of manufacturing. So everyone's either, I'm going to put this rather crudely, you're either trooping off to the City of London to be an extraordinarily well-paid banker, or you're forced to work in Pret or Deliveroo or whatever. That's the kind of polarisation. It's a hollowing out of the labour market. So this stabilising bit of the middle class disappears, which is partly why you're getting all these wild results in first past the post, right? We have to work with that. And part of how we work with that is recognising the politicisation of the rest of life And the fact that there's almost everything starts to look like a politically contested terrain outside of workplaces, and use that to pull together the coalition we want to change things. Now that, I think, is where you have quite a different strategy, sort of British road socialism, or...
But you still do think you could have a supermajority or a big majority in favour of radical economic policies that sort of, like 60% of the population who are fine without having this sort of moderating force and would go for a version of McDonaldism. Unrestrained, unconstrained
on
McDonaldism.
any, well, we know that, right? If you take the sets of proposals in the 2019 manifesto or the 2017 manifesto, if you take any particular proposal, you find a majority in favour of it. Nationalisation, railways, huge. Nationalisation.
Who do they trust to implement it? That's the issue.
Who do they trust to implement it is part of that. And how do you get that trust in conditions where nobody really thinks government can necessarily do very much? That's a sort of primary. It's not really a strategic challenge at that point. It's more a sort of tactical challenge, I'd say. But to get over that, I think we also have to start to think about forms of socialism which are significantly less centralising. That you're talking about a form of socialism where you dig into the sort of stuff that John McDonnell talked about, and Jeremy actually, GDH Cole, the Institute for Workers' Control, the decentralising tradition in certainly English socialism that you've seen from really 1830s onwards, somewhat buried by a big centralising tradition one way or the other, but is there, and we can dig that out and make use of it. And that is one that talks about sort of local autonomy, local decentralised forms of collective or public ownership. You have local authorities that will own something. Municipal socialism can look like a version of that. And for this point in time, that is where we are, and that is what we'll have to rely on in any case, because I think with a very big majority sitting in Westminster, these are our sources of strength for the time being. But how do we build on that and create a movement that can win power nationally is the question to address.
Let's take some questions. Kaylee Browncoat asks, will the Tories blame any failings of Brexit on increased public spending and use that to justify a new round of cuts? So I suppose it's the idea that just as the Cameron Conservative government blamed the consequences of the financial crisis on welfare spending and therefore used it as a... I mean, I don't think this would work for the Conservatives because they've been in power for 9 years.
Yeah. It's a bit... They might try some sort of weird, five-dimensional
chess kind of difficult to do that.
But it's difficult. We haven't really talked about Brexit and what they're going to do with it because it's actually slightly unguessable.
Let's do that. Yeah,
it's slightly unguessable. I've said consistently, and I'm going to stick to it, is that they don't want no deal. No deal is like, you're in government.
Why would with a massive majority you go for no deal?
What's the point?
Bananas.
So they never wanted it before. They don't want it now. There will be over this year. You know very well that they're going to try and set up. They're using the threat of the 2021 no deal cliff edge to set up a sort of row with the EU, which is politically certainly very advantageous for them, and that will no doubt flare up in the run up to summer this year, and then probably by the time you get to autumn be quietly walked away and you get some form of deal. If they don't go for an extension, they do not have very long to strike a deal with anybody, so they may well have a row and then quietly go for an extension, which they can get away with because they've got a big majority.
And people have forgotten in 5 years' time.
Yeah. So it really doesn't necessarily matter that too much.
There was a Tim Montgomery who gave a appalling speech to an audience in Hungary where he was talking about how Boris Johnson would have a special relationship with Viktor Orban, the authoritarian anti-Semitic leader of Hungary. A bunch of he was talking a lot about how the conservatism of Boris Johnson learnt a lot from the conservatism of Orban. It's gone down a bit like a cup of sick in number 10 since this was released. But this was a guy at the top of, potentially still is. They've not confirmed whether he's going to be welcomed back into his job, but he's a top advisor to Boris Johnson. So what he says,
it's a social policy advisor.
Social policy advisor, yeah, social justice advisor. They potentially called him. But one thing he also said in that speech was that what the Conservatives are going to go for is a very close alignment with the Europeans, with the potential to diverge. So it's this idea that they have to agree super quick on something that doesn't crash the economy. And that means agreeing super quick that basically everything's going to stay the same. But what you can sell to the British public is the idea that, yes, everything for now is staying the same, but unlike before, we have the option to diverge if need be. I think he'd said there'll be divergence on future growth industries with the rising nations.
Theresa May's deal.
This is Theresa May's deal.
Which is, given that it's sort of sitting there, waiting for you to take it, I see no reason why they wouldn't do that. There is an argument, I forget who, and it was in The Guardian earlier, which suggested that because the Tories are sort of deeply ideologically committed to divergence now, and because they don't have very much time, they'll go for a bare bones deal, and it will be quite a shock. It'll be quite a hard version of Brexit. It could happen, because they do have freedom of manoeuvre at this point in time, at least domestically. But I'd be surprised if they do that, because it's just so much easier to do a soft Brexit. And you
don't want to damage the economy with a massive majority, do you? Yeah. I mean, that's one way to throw away.
Well, you could do.
Everything
if you have a massive
gained.
majority, you just say, "Oh, the hell with the economy. We'll do what we want. We'll do no deal. What are you going to do about it? We'll probably still win next time round."
I've lost the question, so I can't say who wrote it. But this is it. Crayon Tom. If the red wall is now genuinely marginal, could you foresee a long-term, e.g. 30-year plus, levelling off of the north-south divide?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the challenge there is that our hilarious... There's another reason, by the way, to not have... to bring in proportional representation is that first past the post is just wildly anti-democratic. The hilarious thing about this results is that there is now an incredibly large number of constituencies which are really, really marginal. Well, it's 160 odd within 3%, 5%. So a lot of the places that went from Labour to Tory did so with a very slender majority. But you stack all this up and it's like, oh, there you go, that's your big Tory majority. That's how first past the post exaggerates significant but not overwhelming movements in actual voting behaviour. I mean, the biggest single movement out of Labour was towards non-voting, out of the sets of people who voted from 2017. But anyway, so everything's very marginal, which means the Tories, I think, are going to have to work quite hard, if they're serious about doing this sort of economic strategy to kind of shore up the red wall, or whatever they're going to call it, the blue wall. Then they're going to have to move quite rapidly in doing this. And that would, that should have economic consequences fairly significantly closer than 30 years away. But it is very, very marginal. So there's no guarantee that they actually hold on to most of these seats for next time round. And we shouldn't allow ourselves to be slightly deluded by the fact that these things can shift quite rapidly.
But the argument is that, I suppose the argument is that this is the fact that these are the marginals, that the marginals are in deindustrialized regions, should be positive in terms of generating a version of political competition which favours low-income people, as opposed to when in Tony Blair's time the swing voters were the relatively well-off.
Yeah, it's sort of, you can say one version of what's happened over the last few years is something like this has happened. The marginal voter, if you like, the sort of swing voter has moved further down the income scale, and suddenly a whole load of people who otherwise just, as you say, ignored the 1990s and 2000s suddenly have a great deal of agency and potentially and some ability to affect the world. But the mere fact of them being so marginal across these constituencies means that there is an opportunity for us to potentially win. I just think that to actually turn that potentiality into something solid, because you then want to win and build the thing, to keep hold of it, I think is rather difficult. I mean, swings like that have happened before. If you look at Wilson's first victory, Harold Wilson's first victory in 1964, if memory serves, he turns a Tory majority, which was not quite as big as now, but pretty substantial, into a slender Labour majority. It's not impossible to knock these things quite rapidly, and that was after a long period of Conservative rule, similar to what we're going through at the minute. So I think it's an interesting question, but you have to assume an awful lot about the stability of the political system, never mind the stability of the wider economy over the next 30 years, which I certainly would not want to place money on.
Coping Method asks, which candidate is best poised to implement actual mandatory reselection? Should the membership be pushing hard for this?
I think the answer really is yes. I think we need democracy in the party, and I think we need to present the case seriously and rigorously, not just mandatory reselection, which has become a bit of a... it's this sort of slightly jinxed phrase from the 80s. And we shouldn't think that, by the way, that this is the be-all and end-all. You get this, and then suddenly the left wins everything. I mean, the mandatory reselection, as was in the 1980s, became a way to get rid of the left. If you look at the passing of MPs who actually got reselected and this sort of thing. So you have to say not just open selection, not just the fact that MPs should be, present a case of what they've been doing for the last 5 years in Parliament and win support like this. You have to put it in the context of a wider set of democratic reforms in the Labour Party. And I think that would include autonomy for Scottish and Welsh Labour, for example. I think it could potentially include changes to how the NEC is organised and operates. I think you need to look at what happens at conference. I think possibly we need to change the leadership rules. I think we would go further in saying that this needs to be more open. And you put this in a big package like that. Above all else, I think we also need just an inbuilt culture of democracy. If we're saying, John and Jeremy always said we ought to have a social movement party. If we're serious about this, and if we think that the way back to power and changing stuff is that you build a coalition, the coalition's going to have to include lots and lots of people. We need a party internally that's much more open to this sort of idea, that has a culture of just, we're open to different ways of working with people, that you have a degree of autonomy and constituency Labour parties, for instance, about whether they stand candidates and this sort of thing. There's all sorts of potential ideas there. So you have to put all that together as a package of how we're going to make this more democratic. And then that's also part of how you make the whole country a bit more democratic, a lot more democratic. And this is part of this sort of overhaul of the entire system, I think.
Do you think you need a different version of democracy to, I suppose, the Bennite one, though? So there's the version where sort of you have policy made on the conference floor, and then the agglomeration of that policy turns into a manifesto, which is implemented into government, which I worry is a recipe for making an incoherent mess like they had in 2019.
Yeah, I think that would... the manifesto itself and what it says is all, if you take any part of it, is basically good. The idea that you couldn't do these things, I think, is wrong. You need 10 years rather than 5 years, and perhaps need to be clearer about that, certainly presentationally. And I've written down my own thoughts about what the problems were with the strategy of doing that sort of thing. But so we don't need to get into
Novara Media, I think.
Yes, it was. In particular, that in a world where no one really trusts government to deliver, but they know government can do nasty things, you have to say who is going to pay for this first before you can talk about the nice things. That's basically the version of it. So yes, I do think that we need a more diffuse version of what democracy is, right? And it can emerge in lots of different ways. I think we need local councils and local parties and local organisations, regional organisations that are able to argue to make some of these changes. It's not the same as having government. You're not obviously not as powerful as government, but you have to take these initiatives now. If we have, for example, we say we're doing a Green New Deal, this cannot be. The clock is ticking. This cannot be. Wait for 5 years, hopefully win the election, then you've got 5 years to try and do everything. This has to start now. If people are taking initiatives right now to have local authority ownership of renewable energy, local community ownership of renewable energy, we should be there supporting this and arguing for that to happen absolutely everywhere. We have to think of ways in which that coalition can be assembled, not just as a coalition of here's a party, here's a unions, and maybe here's some protest movements, one sort or another, or different parts of society, different parts of a social coalition. We have to think right now on the ground, what is it that we can put together in lots of different ways, with lots of different people in and outside of the party to make that happen.
If selection get us a chance to primary people, get us our own AOC in every local council, I'm up for it, says Oliver Kahn, who was maybe the person who asked the question, I'm not sure. I think they should offer open primaries. So, I think the problem with just saying we're for mandatory selection is that just seems like Corbyn, the continuity Corbyn, which, to be honest, has its limits. And I don't necessarily think that if you had a bunch of Corbynish candidates winning Labour selections, you'd win a majority. I think you want to go for this idea that, yes, we want to be a more democratic party, but that has to be based on winning huge sections of the population into the democratic process of the Labour Party. And I think you do that with something like open primaries. And also, I think, the problem with mandatory selection, this is why open selections was always a better idea than mandatory selections, is because you get to have a positive campaign whereby I think an MP should be able to stand automatically unless a competitor manages to get X number of supporters, either a percentage of the constituency's population or a percentage of the membership in that
which seems perfectly reasonable.
And then you launch a challenge, which is how AOC challenged or primaried the candidate in her constituency. Let's leave it there. It's been over an hour now. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, James Meadway. Always a pleasure.
No worries.
I will be back on Friday. Aaron will be back tomorrow. I don't know what his show is going to be about, so you'll have to wait and see. Keep an eye on our Twitter for news on that. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind donation, so please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Also, it doesn't cost you anything to like the video, so get down there and hit that like button. No reason not to. Thank you, as always, for your comments throughout the show. Tweet about this show. Put it on your Facebook. We want more people to see it. We want Novara Media to grow so that we can build a stronger, bigger, more critical, but in a nice way, left in Britain. Good evening. Good night.